In November 1965, a musician named George Pelham stood up in front of an audience in Memphis, Tennessee, and said something he should not have said. He was 26 years old. He was performing at a club called the Starlight Lounge on Beale Street. He was not famous. He was the kind of musician who existed in the middle distance of a musical city, competent enough to find regular work, talented enough that the people who knew the scene recognized him, not exceptional enough that anyone outside the scene would have known his name. The audience that night was not large, 40, perhaps 50 people. The kind of Tuesday night crowd at a club like the Starlight, a mix of regulars and people who had wandered in, and people who were between somewhere they had been and somewhere they were going. In the front row was a man named Walter Sims. Walter Sims was 48 years old. He was a music teacher at Carver High School. He had been teaching for 22 years. He was at the Starlight because his wife had wanted to go somewhere with music, and the Starlight was 3 blocks from their house, and he had said yes without particular enthusiasm. He sat in the front row because his wife liked to sit close. He was reading a newspaper. George Pelham saw the newspaper from the stage. He had been playing for 40 minutes. He had, by his own account, given decades later, been having a poor night, the kind of night where nothing connects, where the music you are making sounds correct and empty simultaneously, where the audience and the performer are in the same room but not in any meaningful proximity. And the man in the front row was reading a newspaper. George stopped mid-song. He said something about the man with the newspaper. Not viciously, not cruelly. In the weary, deflecting way of a performer having a bad night who spots an easy target and takes it. A few people laughed. The man put the newspaper down. His wife put her hand on his arm. George continued playing. The moment passed. The show ended. He went home. He thought about it the next morning. He thought, I was unkind. He thought, I should not have done that. And then he thought about it for 40 years. Not constantly, not obsessively, in the specific way that small unkindnesses sometimes settle into the body differently than large ones. Large unkindnesses, the ones you know are wrong as you're doing them, the ones that require deliberate choice, can be contained. You can name them, carry them, eventually set them in the specific internal place reserved for the things you did that you shouldn't have. Small ones are harder. The ones that happened casually, in front of people, at someone's expense, to someone who had done nothing, who was sitting in a club with his wife on a Tuesday night, reading a newspaper, bothering no one. George Pelham's career continued. He played clubs in Memphis for another decade. He toured the South with a backing band in the early 1970s. He recorded one album that received a small regional release. He moved to Nashville in 1975 and worked as a session musician for several years. He retired from performing in 1985 and took a job teaching music at a community center in East Memphis. He taught there for 17 years. In 2005, he was cleaning out a storage room at the community center and found, in a box of old programs and flyers from club shows of the 1960s and 1970s, a Starlight Lounge program from November 1965. He held it. He read his own name on it. And he remembered Walter Sims. He had thought about him intermittently across 40 years. He had not remembered his name. He had not known his name at the time. He knew only that there had been a man in the front row with a newspaper and a wife who had put her hand on his arm after. George described what happened next in a conversation he had with a colleague at the community center, a woman named Patricia Dodd, who had worked alongside him for several years and who wrote about the conversation in a personal journal that her family made available to a researcher after her death in 2019. He told Patricia that he had been looking for the man for years, not actively, not with any formal effort, but in the back of his mind, when he passed the Starlight Lounge, or thought about that period, he had carried a vague intention that if he ever found out who the man was, he would apologize. He asked around. He asked people who had been part of the Beale Street scene in the 1960s. He described the night, the front row, the newspaper, the wife. A man named James Cooley, who had played bass at the Starlight many times in the 1960s and who had an extraordinary memory for the regulars and near-regulars of the Memphis music scene, knew who he was describing. Walter Sims, the music teacher from Carver High. James told George that Walter Sims had retired from teaching in 1988, that he still lived in Memphis, that he was 88 years old. George called him. He had not prepared what he would say. He described this to Patricia afterward. He said he had carried the apology in a general form for 40 years, but had never given it specific language. He called and said who he was. He said he had played at the Starlight Lounge in November 1965. He said he remembered a man in the front row with a newspaper. Walter Sims was quiet for a moment. "I remember," Walter said. George said he was sorry. He described why he had done it, the bad night, the deflection, the specific cowardice of a performer targeting someone easy. He said none of that was an excuse. He said he had thought about it for 40 years. Walter Sims listened to all of it. Then he said something that George Pelham described to Patricia Dodd as the thing he had not expected. "I don't remember being embarrassed," Walter said. George waited. "I remember my wife laughing," Walter said. "She thought it was funny." He paused. "I think I might have thought it was funny too," Walter said, "once I put the paper down." George was quiet. "You've been carrying that for 40 years?" Walter said. George said yes. Walter laughed, not unkindly. The specific laugh of an 88-year-old man who has seen enough of human behavior to find it genuinely amusing when it turns in unexpected directions. "Son," Walter said, "I had forgotten about it before you finished the set." They talked for 23 more minutes, about music, about teaching, about Memphis in the 1960s, about the Starlight Lounge, which had closed in 1971 and whose building was now a parking lot. Walter Sims died in 2007. He was 90 years old. George Pelham described the phone call to Patricia Dodd as the strangest professional experience of his life. Not the most important, not the most meaningful, the strangest. Because he had been carrying something for 40 years that the other person had set down before he reached the parking lot. He had given weight to a moment that the man who received it had not found heavy. He had spent 4 decades being careful about something the other person had not needed him to be careful about. Patricia Dodd described his expression when he finished telling her the story. She wrote that he looked the way people look when they have been holding their breath for a long time and have finally been told they could stop. Not relieved, slightly ridiculous, and completely free. George Pelham retired from the community center in 2008. He moved to a smaller house in Midtown Memphis. He still plays guitar. He gives occasional lessons. He charges $20 an hour. He does not often tell the story of the phone call. When he does tell it, he always ends the same way. "The lesson," he says, "is that the apology is usually for you. The other person is often fine. You're the one who needed to make the call." He smiles when he says it. The smile of a man who knows he waited 40 years to learn something he could have learned on a Wednesday morning in November 1965, and who is glad he learned it at all, regardless of when.